We'll get started in a few minutes. I'm just making sure we have everyone here and making the speakers co-hosts. Ravi, is that you? That's AGGR?
Hi, sorry, I'll just change that.
Okay. Okay, so welcome everyone. This is session 1B. Hopefully you're in the right session looking for cooking and environment. And we have 4 papers. Maybe if you can mute yourself if you're not speaking. So each speaker will have 20 minutes for their paper, and then we have 10 minutes for discussion. 5 minutes of that is for the discussant to the paper. And then the 5 remaining minutes will be for open questions. If you are not presenting, it's probably best to turn off your webcam and mute yourself. And during the Q&A, rather than raising hands, maybe put questions in the chat throughout the presentation, and then they can be taken in succession during the Q&A. If there's additional time, then we can take oral questions as well. The first paper will be Dawit Gutta, and Dawit will be talking about energy transition and suspension of solid fuel use in using Indian panel data. Dawit, can you see if you can share your slides?
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, it looks good. So take it away. I'll give you a 5-minute warning.
Okay. Good. So can I start or?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I welcome everyone. So the title of my presentation is Household Energy Transition and the Suspension of Solid Fuel, using empirical evidence from rural India. So as you can see from this picture, households are using LPG as well as solid fuel simultaneously. So today's topic is about factors influencing household adoption, use, and how that adoption and the use of LPG and how that leads to suspension of solid fuel or fuel stacking. So the content of my presentation looks like this. As we all know, energy access is one of the Sustainable Development Goal, SDG number 7. The World Health Organization has produced a progress report about energy access over the last decade, since 2010 to 2019. From these indicators, we just focus on the clean cooking access, Other report shows there is a slight progress, decrease from 3 billion to 2.6 billion without access to clean cooking in low and middle income countries. However, our interest is not on access, rather on utilization of clean cooking and how that leads to suspension of solid fuel. So consumption of solid fuel, as we all know, causes many problems: environmental, health, climate change problems. This figure from the Health Effect Institute 2020 shows the death rate per 100,000 population across the globe. And as we can see in Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, there is high rate of deaths due to household air pollution. So intervention measures have been implemented to accelerate access to clean cooking solutions. So this has resulted in expanded access to and adoption of clean cooking solutions in recent decades. However, many studies are showing that use of solid fuel is still persisting, and the clean stove is often used concurrently with the solid fuel stoves. And this is a phenomenon known as a stacking or mixed use of multiple fuel utilization. So clean cooking transition, however, requires both adoption and the use of clean cooking solutions, as well as reduction and elimination of low efficiency solid fuel use. So that is the way that we can say there is clean energy transition. Otherwise, if there is simultaneous utilization of clean cooking with solid fuel, still those problems are going to persist. So most studies on this topic have looked at clean cooking adoption and utilization and factors affecting it. And only a few studies have looked at the suspension of solid fuels. So we choose India as a case study because India government has implemented the PMUI subsidy scheme in 2016 to accelerate adoption of LPG by tens of millions of households in poverty. And India is one of the countries with vast dependence on clean cooking fuel still. The International Energy Agency 2017 predicted that about 580 million Indian households are going to still depend on solid fuel by 2030. So the main goal of this study is to analyze factors determining household energy transition and the suspension of solid fuel in India. The data we use is panel data on household energy use, known as the Indian Access to Clean Cooking Energy and Electricity. That was conducted in 2015 and the second round in 2018, 2015 and 2018 by the Council of Energy and Environment and the Water. So the survey covers 741 villages in 51 districts of 6 Indian states. And the number of households which were repeated in both time periods were 7,317 households. After cleaning the data, we used 6,391 households. So this data is chosen because of its panel data nature, which allows us to look at association over time, as well as it had information on both primary fuel use and not use, as well as actual consumption estimates. Sorry. So this graph shows household use of different energy sources for cooking. And as we can see, there is an increase in exclusive use of LPG from about 4.5 to 18% over time. However, at the same time, there is an increase in fuel stacking. Households who are using LPG with solid fuels increased from about 18% to 39%, more than is about double. And still there are many households who are exclusively using solid fuel. About 43% are still using solid fuel only in 2018. So even if there is a shift from LPG to solid fuel, there is still a lot of fuel stacking taking place. So this is just to show some of the variables in between the two time period. We measured household energy consumption in terms of useful energy consumed. That is a megajoule of energy consumed per week after accounting for cooking stove efficiency of respective fuels. So as we can see, there is an increase in LPG consumption over time, more than double, and there is a decrease in consumption of solid fuel over time. So the share of LPG in total cooking fuel as well has around tripled over the time period. It increased from 12% to 32%. So there is an increase in share of LPG in cooking energy choice. And there is also an improvement in household economic status over time. And proportion of LPG users in the village also nearly more than double over the time period. So the econometric model that we applied is a double hurdle model. This model helped us to look at use and not use decision in the first stage, and the intensity of LPG consumption as a share of cooking energy sources in the second stage. So the first stage is about use and not use. The dependent variable is 1 when the household use and 0 otherwise. And then the second stage, if this hurdle is passed, then we have the intensity of LPG consumption as a share of total cooking fuel consumption in the second stage. So these are the variable description. Our focus is on energy share of LPG consumption. If the first hurdle is passed, that household is using LPG. So the empirical econometric model can be specified in this equation form, where the share of LPG consumption is a function of different variables. And these variables are described in this table. So the variables we considered in the model can be classified into fuel-specific characteristics, like distance to LPG market, distance to fuel wood source, relative price of LPG to fuel wood. And the other category is energy users' experience and the perception, length of months since households started using LPG, perception about convenience of cooking with LPG, kitchen location, and so on. The other categories are household-specific characteristics, which include wealth index, household expenditure, primary source of income, household demographic characteristics, and who is making decision in the household, the caste group and religion, and so on. The fourth category of variables are village level variables, including the proportion of LPG using households in the village and households living in the subsidized community and the community where at least one household received subsidy or not. And we also have time dummy to control for temporal dynamics. And we have spatial heterogeneity controlled using village fixed effect. And now we have PMU subsidy use or not, beneficiary or not beneficiary. So our result shows that share of LPG consumption positively depends on the Wales index on household expenditure as a proxy for income, primary source of income, whether household is, in which line of primary source of income households are engaged, social strata, being in a well-off group associated with higher consumption of LPG as energy share, health education at all level was positive and significantly affecting share of LPG consumption, proportion of LPG users in the village due to learning effect has positive and significant effect on LPG consumption as a share, and households experience or length of use of LPG measured in number of months has positive effect, and interaction of Wales index with the PMUI subsidy has positive effect, while PMU subsidy being beneficiary had negative effect on LPG consumption share. The dependency ratio, woman involvement in decision making, age of head, religion, and year dummy, these all variables have positive and significant effect on statistically significant effect on the LPG share. On the other hand, distance to LPG market, relative price of LPG to fuel wood, debt status of household, cooking location, LPG convenience, cooking with LPG convenience, perception of household about cooking with LPG, PMU subsidy, and household size. This had negative effect on LPG consumption share. Therefore, in conclusion, between 2015 and 2018, use and exclusive use of LPG increased, though many households are still using both simultaneously. Affordability, better perception about convenience of cooking with LPG, familiarity with the technology, peer learning and education are variables that were associated with higher consumption of LPG and the suspension of solid fuel, while long distance travel to refill, high relative price of LPG compared to fuel wood had inhibited cooking energy transition. So the PMU subsidy promoted adoption of LPG, but it was associated with lower intensity of consumption. Therefore, proper refill subsidy may be needed to encourage greater shift toward this LPG consumption and suspension of solid fuel. Thank you, and these are the acknowledgements that we have. The project was financed by Clean Cooking Implementation Science Network, and these are the people who have collaborated in this research. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dawit. I was going to give you the 5-minute warning, but you were finished ahead of time. So congratulations. You prevented me from having to do that. So I think your discussant is Marta. Marta, are you
Yes.
there? Yeah. And do you have slides to share or just comments?
I have just some notes that
Okay.
I'm gonna share just to make it easy to see. Okay.
Great.
Yeah, so Dawit, thank you so much for this paper. It was really nice to read it. And I think the data set is super interesting and the methodology you're using too. I've been reading about both the data set and the methodology for my PhD. So it's really great to see them being used. So in terms of content, I think I really like the fact that I think like you have a nice interdisciplinary team for this project. So you've converted the fuel, so LPG and firewood and tankates, into their actual energy content to make them comparable. And I've seen like other paper and myself, I've sometimes like use the amount of time a stove is used. And I think like the methodology used might have some advantages with respect to that, because if people use LPG and firewood to cook different type of meals, for example, like a quick but high heat type of cooking, they choose LPG, while for slow simmering they use firewood. Then probably using like the time the stove is on is not a good comparison. So yeah, I would like you to explain a bit more what are the advantages of using this method instead of the amount of time each stove is on, to compare the use. And then I would like, from the descriptive statistic, it looks like the total energy used by a household stays the same, at least on average. So if we sum the energy content of the LPG used and the energy content of the firewood used, it's like the average is stable around 120 megajoule per week. So I was wondering if you looked at whether this is the case also at the household level, or households who adopt LPG then tend to consume more total energy or less total energy. And then I also found like very interesting that you, like in one of your specifications, you interact being a MUI receiver, like receiving the subsidies for LPG connection with the wealth level. And so you can say that within the recipients of these subsidies, those that are slightly more well off tend to use more LPG. So you present like an interesting evidence that refill affordability seems to indeed be an issue, because people receive the subsidy only for the LPG connection, but then they have to pay for the refill themselves. Yeah. And then I found like interesting the results about the fact that people who work outside of the agriculture sector use more LPG. And I think these links very nicely with some more literature that looks at the fact that sometimes households who work in agriculture and work in the field collect like agricultural residue and firewood directly from the field while they're working. So the marginal cost of that fuel for them is very low because they're already in the field. So it's not an extra time for the harvesting. So I think this is a really nice connection with the literature. Yeah, and then was also another question I had, like in the paper, it looks like the decision making in the household changed between wave 1 and wave 2. So there are more women involved in decision making in the second wave. And I was wondering if you have any insight on what might be happening in this period, because it's just, you know, a few years changed, but it seems like women empowerment might be taking place. So yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marta. David, give you maybe 2 minutes to respond to Marta. And then there are a few questions in the chat trickling in. Others, feel free to put more questions in the chat as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Marta. Yeah, maybe regarding the total energy consumption, yeah, it is about, in 2015, it was about 226 megajoule per week. And then 2018, it was 122.17 megajoule. There was about 4 megajoule per week decrease over time because of substitution of LPG for solid fuel. Mm-hmm. Of course, in another separate paper, we are looking at how household energy consumption has been affected due to LPG adoption, because LPG is more efficient than solid fuel. So when households shift more to consumption of LPG, then their energy efficiency is going to improve. So there is 4 megajoule per week decrease over time due to this substitution. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other question was about about agricultural, non-agricultural activities. I think, yeah, as you said, households can easily get solid fuel when they are engaged in agriculture, and there is also higher capacity of generating more income to spend on LPG, refill LPG, and they can make transition to LPG, and there is also labor constraint might be to engage in labor in solid fuel collection. So, sorry, the other, sorry. Yeah, the PMU subsidy, as you raised, it is targeted to households in poverty. So these households adopt the technology because of the subsidy. However, they are not using it because they do not have capacity to refill it, affordability problem. So the questions, maybe if I can see the questions, I can just.
I think you have addressed the main one. I can send you my comment and then you
maybe if there is something I missed.
No, you've done the main one. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Dawit, maybe for your help, I will read some of the questions that are in the chat. So the first one was about the panel, and it was from me. You mentioned the sample size, but you didn't say if a lot of households were lost from the initial wave. Do you have any information on that? And also, what aspect of the data cleaning led to also loss of about 1,000 households? And whether this affects any of the interpretation of your findings?
Yeah, great. Yeah. This was stated in the paper, of course, how I cleaned the data. When I cleaned the data, households who didn't respond, I don't know to, let's say, the amount of firewood consumed, the amount of LPG consumed, the amount of dung cake consumed or agro residue consumed. If they say, I don't know, I just cancel those households and rebalance the data. So in this process, around 900 something households were cancelled from the data.
Okay.
Because it is not possible to impute for these households. They don't know what amount of fuel they consumed.
Yep.
So in that case, I deleted them.
Just a suggestion might be to see whether those households are systematically different from the rest of your sample, just so that you know whether your results generalize or not, or if it's a selected sample. But that's a minor point. There's also a question from Mook Bangalore, who asks if you have the change in energy content from 2015 to 2018 and the energy source, could you also calculate the change in pollution generated? And if you find that even moderate use of LPG reduces pollution, that might be an interesting result. So that's a suggestion. I don't know if you want to reply to that comment.
Okay. Yeah, basically just what we focused on was on use or not use and the amount of use, just converted into useful energy consumption at final stage after accounting for stove efficiencies. And yeah, that's what we considered, and we didn't see other associated issues.
Okay. And then I asked two analysis questions. Maybe you can just answer one orally in the interest of time, and then the other one you can maybe take in the chat later on. But one, did you include all of the full set of controls, both in the first stage as well as the second stage where you estimate the share? And if so, can you comment on whether the drivers on the extensive margin of using any LPG are different than the drivers of the share of LPG used? Because that might be interesting. And then the second question was, your title says, or it suggests that you looked at suspension, which would be exclusive use of LPG, and there's a small set of such households in your sample. Did you look actually separately at the drivers of being in that group that uses LPG exclusively rather than is involved in stacking, which is what your hurdle model gets at? So maybe just answer one of those now, and then you can take the other one in the chat. afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. So I just looked at using some random effect probit only suspension, exclusive use of LPG and completely abandoning solid fuel separately, but I didn't include in this paper. The results are more or less similar. The variables that have positive effect here have positive effect there. But our interest is not only on complete suspension, but the transition process use as well as share of LPG means if it is, let's say, more than 90%, that means you are closer to suspension, although that is not exclusive use of LPG. So it captures, the dependent variable captures every form of energy users. So the increase in the share means the more you are going closer to exclusive use of LPG. But separately, I didn't look at the exclusive use of LPG or complete suspension of solid fuel in this paper. But I did test, and the result is more or less what we expect in another extension file.
Okay, thank you, Dawit. Very interesting presentation. So next is Marta. And Marta, feel free to take it away.
Can you see the full
Yes.
screen? All right, perfect. Thanks so much, Mark. So the paper I'm presenting today here at SETI is a paper I've been working on with Subrendra Patnaik, Ipsita Das, Jessica Lewis, and Ashok Kumar Singha. And it's titled Speaking from Experience, and looks at preferences for cooking with biogas in rural India. So the research question we address in this paper is, first of all, what might affect preferences for biogas. So we look at whether having had experience with the technology can affect the willingness to pay for it. And we look at both, like whether households have had good experience with the technology, meaning they had no trouble with the functioning it, or and whether there's a different effect for households who've had bad experience. So households who experience malfunctions, such as like their technology broke down, for example, or couldn't get it repaired. And then we also want to test an hypothesis, which is like in the literature, risk aversion and impatience have been shown to lower willingness to pay for innovation, for new technologies that are innovative and people are unfamiliar with. And we want to see if having a certain degree of experience with the technology can counteract this negative effect of risk aversion and impatience. So we focused on biogas because it's an interesting technology for rural households in particular, because it has a number of co-benefits. So the way a biogas works is you have to install a biogas digester, which is kind of customized to the customer needs. And it's installed outside of the households, and it gets fed with manure from livestock, for example, but possibly even from latrine. And it undergoes a process of fermentation in this tank. And the fermentation of the manure releases methane gas, or natural gas, which can then flow into the pipes, into the household, and it can be used in the same way as LPG, connected to a gas stove. The residuals that are left in the biogas digesters is a slurry, which can be, which is like just a byproduct, but it can be used as a fertilizer. It's actually a very effective organic fertilizers that is more effective than just using manure as it is in the field. So in terms of co-benefits, it also has, it's cheaper because, of course, if you're a rural household who is already herding livestock, you have free fuel pretty much. And it means you don't have to use as much firewood, so it's good for the environment, for deforestation, and of course, gas, biogas as well as LPG. It's a clean fuel, so it reduces the emissions and in the households as well as greenhouse gases. So we focus on the state of Odisha for this project because there's what the Odisha Renewable Energy Development Agency has provided subsidies to households to install biogas, and they in their website they explain the advantages, what they call gobar gas plant, which means like manure gas plant. And again, they show how like it's convenient for cooking. It also improved hygiene because it's a good way of dispose of waste. It's cheaper if you already have livestock. It gives you fertilizers and can prevent deforestation and environmental degradation, as well as making a cleaner cooking environment in the kitchen. So we conducted fieldwork in 2011, 2012. Here are some pictures of actual biodigesters being constructed in households. And the households were interviewed. They conducted these very long surveys, and they were asked for their willingness to pay as well, using a discrete choice experiment. So the sample was chosen through a stratification process. So we wanted to get from each village that we conducted the project in, we selected households that had a working biogas, so that have had positive experience with biogas, then households who have a biogas plant but is not working at the moment, so it malfunctioned, it broke down, and they couldn't repair it, and this is the negative experience group. And then we have two other strata of households with no experience with biogas. One is a household who use other form of clean cooking, for example, LPG or kerosene or electric stoves, and might as well be using, of course, other like a traditional stove, because fuel stacking is, of course, very prevalent. And the final stratum is the one where the households who only use the chula, which is the traditional oven, the traditional cook stove. So in total, we interviewed 503 households. During the survey, we also conducted a risk aversion and time preferences exercises. So for risk aversion, we asked households whether they would prefer to receive 500 rupees now for sure, or you would prefer to flip a coin, and if you're lucky and it turned up heads, you can receive 1,200 rupees. But if it turned up tail, then you receive 0. And depending on the answer they give, we either raise the stakes or lower them. And we classify the households who always choose the safer options as the risk-averse household. So risk aversion is a dummy in our model. We do something similar for time preferences or impatience. We ask households whether they would prefer to receive 1,000 rupees tomorrow, so one day from now, or whether you're willing to wait 12 months to receive double that amount, so 2,000 rupees. Again, depending on the answer they give, we either raise the stakes or lower them. And we classify the households who always choose the earliest option, so the tomorrow option. We classify them as impatient. So again, like we in our model, we include time preferences as a dummy. Then the last part of the survey we conducted was a discrete choice experiment. We provided these choice cards, like the one you can see on the right. And households had to choose whether they prefer to have the rocket stove, the gobar gas, which is the biogas, or the traditional chula. And each of these stoves was presented with different level of price, different levels of maintenance assistance, smoke emissions, and fuel requirements. And on the left, you can see all the levels that we use in the discrete choice experiments. So we combined these levels in a K-efficient framework. It came up with 25 total choice cards, which we divided into 5 blocks. So households were then randomly assigned to each of these 5 blocks, and each household answered 5 of these discrete choice questions. So they saw 5 different cards, and in each card they had to decide which stove they preferred, given the attributes provided. Then the way we estimate our data, like we estimate the model, we rely on a random utility model. So utility has a fixed kind of deterministic component, which is given by V, and it depends on the technology you choose and the attribute it has. And then there's a random stochastic component that kind of like take up the variation in preferences from the households. The way we estimate this model is using a random parameter logit and the maximum simulated likelihood estimator. So while like in the literature, a common way of doing it before was to use conditional logit, which didn't take into account that the same household is making more than one decisions. The random parameter logit has the advantage that it does consider that I is the same household making the decisions like 5 times. So in the model, we account for this panel structure, and the identification relies on the choices that the same households make over the 5 choice cards. So for the deterministic component of the utility, we use just a linear function, which depends on what the level of the technology, so whether it's biogas, rocket stove, or the traditional chula, and then it includes the level of the attributes and the price. We reparameterize this function in willingness to pay space, which is kind of like one of the bit of a recent development for these methods. And this means that basically we just rewrite the parameters so that the parameters that get estimated from the model are directly the willingness to pay for each attribute and the willingness to pay for the alternative specific constant. So whether it's biogas or a rocket stove. And we clustered the standard errors at the village level because, as I said, we sampled households for each strata, for each village. So the first set of results I'm showing you is the baseline results, where we just have the willingness to pay for each attribute on the left, and then the willingness to pay for each technology after controlling for the attributes on the right. So what I'm showing you is the distribution, because what the random parameter logit does is it considers that each household might have a different willingness to pay for this technology. And so it provides a distribution of what the willingness to pay will be over all the households. And I've included what the mean and the confidence interval for the mean are. So from the left, we can see that smoke reduction is the attributes that get the highest willingness to pay, with an average of almost 5,000 rupees. But there's a lot of variation, so the standard deviation of the curve is pretty high. Then we have a high willingness to pay for fuel efficiency as well, but slightly lower than for smoke reduction, around 3,000 rupees on average. And finally, maintenance assistance is not significant. The mean is not significantly different from 0. So receiving assistance for the stove is a less sought after attribute. And then we conduct, which I'm not sure I'm presenting, but we see that this actually depends on whether the stove being chosen is biogas or not. So for biogas, actually the maintenance assistance attribute has a higher willingness to pay, which is because it's an unfamiliar technology and it requires a lot of maintenance, like specialized maintenance. On the right, we see the willingness to pay for biogas and for the rocket stove. And we can see that biogas does attract a lot of interest. So households have, even after controlling for all the attributes, households are still willing to pay a premium for a biogas stove. On the contrary, for the rocket stove, the willingness to pay is negative, meaning that if they had to choose between a rocket stove and a chula with the same attributes, they would always prefer chula, or most people would prefer chula. So this is kind of an interesting result, because the rocket stove, which is like firewood based, firewood fuel, which is like more efficient than the traditional stove, is the solution that is being pushed for by the private sector. And as we can see, it doesn't seem to be having a great reception in the area. While biogas, which is the one that's being pushed by the local government, seems to be a solution which people are really interested in. For the second specification of the model, we interact the attributes with the fuel. So just looking on the left, we can see, as I say, that maintenance assistance does have a willingness to pay if the stove is a biogas stove. You can see the dashed line. Some as a higher willingness to pay compared to maintenance assistance in case of one of the firewood or like biomass stove. And the difference for the other two attributes instead is not that big. Then we look at what explains kind of the heterogeneity in willingness to pay for biogas, because in the previous figure we could see that it's a very spread out curve. And so we divide the sample by the experience level of the household and interacted it with the biogas alternative specific constant. And we find that households that have had good experience with the biogas system, so their biogas system never broke down, have the highest willingness to pay. And it's like a quite precise estimate, very low standard deviation. Second, there's the group who had bad experience with the technology. They have lower willingness to pay, but still positive and quite significant. And the last group is the group that had no experience with biogas up to this point. They still have a positive willingness to pay for biogas, even after controlling for all the attributes. But again, it's much lower than the other two groups, and it is more spread out. So people have a higher variance of preferences for this technology.
You have 5 minutes, Marta.
Yes. So then what we want to look at is, as I say, there's in the literature, there's evidence that households who are risk averse and households who are impatient are less willing to pay for technologies that are innovative and that they are less familiar with. So we interact, again, the same, the biogas label, the biogas alternative specific constant with both the experience and the risk aversion dummy. And we find that for households of good experience and for households who've had bad experience, the difference in willingness to pay between risk averse and less risk averse households is very small. It's not statistically significant at the mean. While if we look at the group who has had no experience, here's where we really see a big gap. So households who are less risk averse have a positive willingness to pay for biogas, while the households who are more risk averse have a very low and not distinguishable from zero willingness to pay for biogas. So they have much lower preferences for this new technology that they're unfamiliar with. And we see a similar results if we look at the time preferences. So if we look at impatience of the households instead of risk aversion. Again, we find that the gap between patient and impatient households who've had good experience with the technology, it's very small. The willingness to pay is very close to each other, and at the mean is not statistically significantly different. Same for bad experience. They have very close willingness to pay, very close distributions. But again, when we look at households who've had no experience, those who have patient, so they have like lower discount rates for the future, tend to have much higher willingness to pay compared to the households who are impatient. So they have a preference for the present time. They have very high discount rate for the future, and the willingness to pay a premium for biogas is much smaller. So to conclude, what we see in this research is that in the area we're looking at, there's very strong interest for biogas, but there is heterogeneity, both like unobserved heterogeneity, which we capture in our model, and that we try to explain through a couple of different lines. So there is heterogeneity in terms of what type of experience the households have had, and then also in terms of their risk aversion and time preferences. We'd also find that experience, both positive and negative, does mitigate the negative effect of risk aversion and impatience. This means that while monetary incentives probably need to still be provided for this technology because it's quite expensive, and for the lower income households it might not be affordable, it might be useful to complement these incentives with trials so that households can acquire experience with the technology before committing to it. But then also, this should be paired with a strong repair and maintenance services and assistance. This is because once households get a negative experience, so if their stove break down and they can't repair it easily, they really seem to start to dislike it. And there is even, we even found some cases of households that completely lost interest in the technology and they don't even want to repair it anymore. So yeah, and from focus group as well that we conducted and from the results of our analysis, we see that good quality of the plants and accessible repair and maintenance services are really critical for biogas to ensure that it keeps being used and that it doesn't attract like negative comments that might then spread out in the village to other households as well. Finally, there are still a couple of points that we're still looking at. So maybe people in the audience or Mark that will act as a discussant can help us through with this. We're looking at methodologies to control for covariates in the model because the random parameter logic per se doesn't really allow us to introduce many covariates unless we kind of like keep splitting the sample. So we're thinking perhaps of applying like a matching or an inverse probability weighting to the different strata in the sample to balance on observables, for example.
30 seconds.
Yeah. And similarly, we're looking into some way to introduce selection into owning biogas and control like why some is like are households that already have biogas different in some dimensions compared to the households who do not have biogas, and it is important to control for. So again, we're trying to think through how to model selection into the specification. Finally, yeah, some other things we could do is doing some more work on how to include risk aversion and impatience in the model. So instead of using a dummy, try to use a category or a continuous variable. And finally, trying to understand a bit more why there's this very low willingness to pay for the rocket stoves, that the private sector is kind of so interested in pushing in this context, but households are still not interested. It might be just that they're very unfamiliar with it; they haven't seen it in use yet, or it might be that they would prefer to switch away from firewood. But this is all like work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you, Marta. Okay, so I'm the discussant for this paper. Lucky you. I think I'll start off by saying this is a nice paper with very rich data on preferences, which is useful for testing the hypotheses you're looking at. I think the comparison of rocket and biogas technologies is interesting, although you don't play this up very much in the paper and even in your presentation. So that's somewhere where you could do a little bit more thinking and work, but it would also sort of change the orientation of the paper. And I kind of like the paper focusing on biogas as it is. It's generally easy to follow. You've used, pretty well-established methods, and I think you use them well. In particular, in your slides, you had a nice way of showing your results, which were much better than what was in the paper, actually. That was going to be one of my comments, is that, it was very confusing looking at these tables and all of these overlapping confidence intervals and things. But I think the way you've shown those distributions in the slides is very helpful, and encourage you to incorporate those into the paper rather than those other presentations. I guess I have three main comments. One is on your proposed solutions. So you propose technology trials and making available maintenance and repair services. I was wondering how the first of these would work, actually, because it's not like this is a simple technology that you can just kind of go around and shop with. The biogas installation is pretty significant. So how would a trial look? And would that be enough? If you installed this at the community level, is that enough? Probably not, because all of these households had access to them in their communities, right? So how would these trials work? That's kind of one worry about that recommendation. And And then, you know, on the maintenance services, obviously, is the cost really worth the additional benefit? And here, I think you could do some calculations and see if, you know, this would be something that would be justified. I'm actually quite skeptical in general of the net benefits logic of biogas. So I think you could do more on this because you make statements in the paper throughout that, you know, biogas is a clean technology.
Mhm.
It's very nice and everything. But you don't really establish that the willingness to pay here is anywhere close to what it actually costs to install these devices. And then, you know, what the social benefits are beyond that. Okay, second comment is on the DCE, and it's a little bit related. I was wondering about why the price levels for the GoBar and the Rocket were set at the same level, because the GoBar gas, the biogas one, is much more expensive in general.
Mhm.
So, you know, I was worried that respondents might think that this didn't make sense. And so, you know, that would kind of color responses to the DCE. It seemed like all cards had one of each technology, but you should clarify that in your paper because it's not fully described and obvious. And then, you know, related to this point about the rocket stove, it seems like, you know, you make a lot of this experience issue, but I doubt that many of these households had any experience with the rocket stove. So that could actually be one of the explanations for why willingness to pay is so low for the rocket stove, and might, you know, put these results in context. And then the third comment is more a question about, is it really experience that colors willingness to pay, or is it, you know, something else? So Subrendu has heard many versions of this kind of comment before, and he's probably rolling his eyes right now. But you could sort of think about this a little bit more systematically by moving away from this mixed logit approach and kind of going to a latent class logit, where you actually try to identify different classes of preferences and then see what kinds of socioeconomic characteristics and whether experience with GoBar explain membership in any of those latent classes. And that would allow you to go into a more multivariate framework for thinking about this, which is something you can't easily do, as you pointed out, with the mixed logit approach. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, those are great comments. Thanks so much. Yeah, in terms of trials and how can people get you know, experience, because of course the biogas digesters are like permanent structures, right? It's not like you can keep them and take them back. Yeah, things like we were thinking about, and I think we mentioned in the paper, would be having something like a community kitchen, for example, if there's a local school or local community centers, they could be installed there, and households could, like, if they're involved in events at the community, they could, you know, experience, like, try to cook with it. And of course, you know, it needs some organizations, right? Because this is actually a technology that requires a lot of maintenance, so you need to kind of be involved and spend time on it every day. You need to feed it and clean it and so on. So yeah, another possibility would be to have kind of like you know, technology champions in a village who have the technology and are willing to let other people try it. So these are like possibilities we were thinking of. But I agree. There's like the logistic is something that is not super easy with this technology compared to others, like a rocket stove, for example. On the price levels of rocket stove, they're too high. Yeah, I think the reason for putting the same levels is kind of like a clear identification in the model, so like that you don't do like out of sample you know, predictions. And it really, you can really kind of separate the effects of biogas from the effects of the price and the other attribute levels. But yeah, it's probably true that on one side the prices are too high for a rocket stove, although they still were not chosen much, even at the lowest price, which was like 4,000 rupees. I think it's more reasonable. Yeah, and about experience with the rocket stove, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that's I think this is one of the main reason why households are not choosing it, is that they really don't know what it is. Not probably no one in the villages, or almost no one in the villages we surveyed, has a rocket stove already. It's a very new technology. So this might very much explain why there's so little interest in it compared to biogas, which, like, in all the villages we interviewed, at least someone had biogas. So it's much more common.
Maybe I'll just stop you there and give you a
Yes.
chance to see Rob's question, which is about repair and maintenance services, and whether your field data collection offers any insights on how to design effective maintenance services, given that customers might not know that those services are even dependable in the first place.
Yeah, so the reason why we included the maintenance attribute in the first place in the discrete choice experiment is that because maintenance really popped up a lot during focus group with talking about biogas with households who do have biogas. This was really something that kept coming up and people were asking for. But yeah, we don't really have any insights on exactly how those services might look like. But yeah, I'll need to look a bit more into that, to be honest. Yeah, but that's a good comment. And yeah, I think so the way it works to install a biogas, at least in that area, is that you need to have like a specialized like mason or someone who come to your house and build it. And you can kind of I think, like, you can provide like your own work and some materials so that it gets cheaper in the end. But you do need these like specialized masons to do the main job. So like to have like maintenance and repair services, one way would just be like to have one of these specialized people available in the village, right? Because if you need to go to a different village, then it gets complicated as well. But yeah, I agree, Rob. Another experiment to run.
All right,
Sure.
time's up. Thanks, Marta. Okay, so our third presenter is Adolfo. And Adolfo, feel free to share your screen.
Okay, thank you. 1 minute, please. Can you hear me well?
Can hear you, yeah. Your screen
Okay,
is
super.
coming. And we see your screen now too. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, it's there. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. My name is Adolfo Uribe. I'm a PhD student at Universidad de Talca. Today I will present this work that is called Private Benefits from Air Pollution Reduction Policies, Evidence from Across the Chilean Income Distribution. Yeah, other authors of this work is Carlos Chávez, Walter Gómez, Marcela Jaime, y Randy Brewston. Okay, like a main motivation of this work, air pollution reduction policies generate these public benefits, yeah? But less often are considered also the private co-benefits. The private co-benefits incentive the adoption of clean technologies, and also we know that individual private efforts contribute to the air quality. So in this work, what we do is we use a field experiment to estimate the key private benefits from a program to replace inefficient wood-fired heating stove with more efficient pellet stove in central Chile, yeah, in the city of Talca, where I'm here now in Talca. Our analysis focuses on three outcome variables. First, the indoor air quality in terms of values. Of variable, we focus in PM 2.5, PM 2.5 in microgram per cubic meter. We also focus in the indoor temperature, in the comfort that face the households. And also, we are interested in the expenditure on fuel in Chilean pesos. So for us, it's also interesting to know who get the benefits of this program, yeah, in terms of income distribution. So that's the analysis that we do. Regarding the context in Chile, in Chile we face high levels of air pollution, especially in central and southern Chile. Yeah, the main cause of this is the inefficient home heating. Yeah. We also face high levels of energy poverty in the whole country, but that is much more intensive in the south. Yeah, for example, 60% of energy poverty in the city of Valdivia, according to some previous studies. The main dimension of this energy poverty are the high energy costs and the low comfort that the households face. Yeah. From several years, in the last 10 years, the Ministry of Environment has carried out different stop replacement programs, yeah, in more than 30 cities in Chile, changing the technology with different focus, different amount of subsidies. So more than 50,000 replacements have been done until now. Yeah, in Talca, in the city of Talca, each year more than 1,000 subsidies for these replacements are offered to households. So what we did last year, we conducted a field experiment where we randomly select households that they had a new technology, a pellet new stove, households that they got this technology last year, 2018, 2 years from now, 2 years before, and a control group, a group of households that they were applying for this new program. Yeah, we select this control group according to, so that was randomly, but we also consider same characteristics as the treatment group in order to balance these subsamples. That's a picture of these two kind of technologies that we face. In the left side is an example of a firewood heating stove for the control group, and the second side the pellet heating stove that the subsidy offered. So this intervention was done in the last part of the winter last year. Yeah, that was done in the middle of the COVID pandemic in Talca. We visit twice the households. First, we install devices, electronic devices, PM2.5 sensors, and also zoomed stove use monitors in the stoves. We also give to the households a 2-page paper spreadsheet in order they write down, they can write down the fuel consumed as self-reporting. In a second visit, after 88 hours, we remove all the materials. Yeah, that's important to say that each household we measure these variables only 48 hours. Yeah, in this 1 month of the field work. After this time, we clean that devices. We say we follow the safety protocols in order to prevent these effects of the pandemics. So we clean the devices, and then we move these devices to another households around the city. Also, we perform a mobile phone survey, yeah, in order to get more specific information and also more details about for future control variables of our analysis. So in this slide, I show you how was the intervention regarding the devices. So here we have the fire stove from 2 or 3 meters from the stove. We install the PM2.5 sensor. This sensor also was able to measure temperature and humidity. We are also focusing temperature. We install the same sensor outside in order to control for the conditions outside the household, and we install these stop use monitors. The idea is to identify with these zooms when the stove, the moment of the time when the stove was used by the household. We did that for pellet and for firewood stoves. So we visit households around the whole city. This picture is the city of Talca. So in blue color are households with pellet stoves, in red color with firewood stoves. And also we balance. So at the end we balance this group, and from 13 variables, in only once we identify that they are not similar, are 5% of significance. That variable was a family member, the number of the size, so the size of the. As a descriptive statistic, here I show you in outcome variables in the first panel in the corner in the left side. We see the indoor PM2.5. You can see that we appreciate this difference during the evening, actually, when the stove, when it's colder and the stove are used more, with more frequency. In terms of self-report cost for the fuel use, we can see a difference between pellet and firewood stove. We didn't see a difference regarding indoor temperature, but if we go a little bit more deep, we identify difference in the variability of that temperature, between these two groups. So our specification, we tried two specifications. First, a fixed effect panel model for the variables indoor air pollution, PM2.5, and indoor temperature. Here, our variable of interest is this interaction, pellet on. That means the fact of having a pellet stove and also using it. So we tried this specification for all the households and for all the hours that the household was measured. So here I said again, we only have 48 hours. So that is an unbalanced panel. We don't have data for the whole period of the study in the same household. Second specification, here I show a cross-section model in order to analyze the variance of the air temperature, the indoor temperature, and the cost of fuel. Here in this specification, the variable of interest is pellet. It's just this time, just having a pellet in comparison with the other group. As main results, for the first specification, we identify a reduction of indoor PM2.5, around 13% of less PM2.5. And also we don't, as we already see in that figure, we don't identify a difference regarding indoor temperature. So both groups, they reach an average same temperature. Regarding the second specification, this cross section, we identified a difference in the variability of the temperature. That for us is also a benefit. That is also comfort. And regarding the cost of this fuel, when we compare both groups, we have this information from 48 hours. That was the time that the devices were running in the household. But also we ask in the survey the amount of fuel that they use during the last month and the last year. So we also identify differences that positive difference that the cost is higher for pellet users compared with firewood stoves. Now, if we, so for the fixed effect panel, Okay, since income is something that doesn't change on time, we split this group among income distribution in 3 groups. And when we do that, the effect of this interaction, having a pellet stove and using, is much more higher for the lower income. So we can say that the benefits, the bigger benefits of this program are being obtained for the lower top of the income distribution, the lower bottom of the income distribution. So as main conclusions, we identify reductions. So in this program in Talca, that was done in central Chile, identify benefits, for the group that they have these new stoves. A reduction of 13% of indoor concentrations, and this reduction increases to 28 for the lower income households. We don't find differences between indoor temperature, but we find differences in terms of reduction in variance, or this variability. But these benefits also, they have something maybe, okay, not so, that is not a real surprise, but we identify this higher cost for pellet users, since pellet is a more efficient fuel, and also the households buy the pellet in different markets, then it's more regulated at firewood in Chile. Regarding future research, okay, right now we're moving to Temuco, that is in southern Chile. So that's the city, a colder city. We will do similar work there, but we will focus also in the interaction with another program, that is with isolation program, in order to improve the efficiency of the whole heating system of the house. And also we hope going back again to the same households in Talca at the end of this, in the same period of last year, at the end of this winter. So we still need a lot of more things to do here regarding this project. So thank you. That is the presentation about these main results of this work.
Thank you, Adolfo. You were also well under time, so you have plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Great, that's good.
And Dawit is your discussant. So Dawit, why don't you go ahead? Dawit, are you still there?
Hello. Thank you very much, Adolfo, for very interesting presentation. I like your presentation, as well as the topic that you covered is very interesting. The paper covers an interesting topic, and the methodology is robust, and the experiment is very clear, and the result is very interesting. I have some very minor technical questions. First, I think the title should be explicit. As it appears, things are not very clear. You said that air pollution reduction policies, which is very broad topic, but your research focuses on pellet stove alone, and air pollution reduction policies is a bit concept that is very vague. It needs to be very specific. And maybe you can say the case of pellet stoves for heating purpose in Chile or something like that. The second one is, was the sample design purposive to include income distributions of all levels so that it will be representative for Chile? Or just you draw, I think, a random sample, and you compared from those random sample the variation across income groups. but I don't know whether that is really representative for Chile to see the income distribution. I don't know if it is purposefully done, it is well done, but if it's only from that random sample, generalizing for the Chile income distribution might be challenging. The other question I have is about why you choose the period August 13 to September 13, 2020, given the residential heating demand is seasonal, specifically during the cold season, there is high demand, and during the warm season, there is no demand at all. So how did you consider that seasonality? And the other is maybe clarification. If there is a pellet stove, I'm not sure about the Chilean case. If there is a market for pellet stove, it would be interesting to compare subsidized and non-subsidized pellet stove users. Yeah, it's not stated in the paper. Maybe if it is a new technology and no household is not accessible in the market, then it is fine. But if it is accessible in the market, then you can compare subsidized and unsubsidized pellet stove as well. And yeah, the other is identification of private benefits. Maybe it is important to identify what are the private benefits and what are the public benefits, and that you focused only on the private benefit, not on the social benefit. So what is the difference between these two? The concept need to be clarified. Yeah, maybe two other questions might be not relevant, but given the short time period, it is impossible to quantify the health expenditure, because the adoption of pellet stove is beneficial for health. In the long run, it will have impact on health. There will be difference in health expenditure between traditional stove users and the pellet stove users. And the other is still related to this is cost. The cost issue is about short run and long run issue. The cost benefit itself comes over time, because you invest on pellet stove once, then the cost or the benefit is coming over years until you use that technology. Might be it is interesting to recommend, I don't know, maybe if you are going to consider it in the future or not, I don't know. So these are mainly technical questions that I have. Otherwise, it's interesting result and interesting topic. Yeah.
Oh, great, thank you. I should give you some answers. Yes, I will do it.
Yeah, feel free.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Everything you say has sense for me. Thank you so much. Maybe I can say something now. Well, we draw just a random sample between these two groups. So, and we didn't know at the beginning the income level. Yeah, because this program in Chile actually it's not a social program. It's the Ministry of Environment does not ask about the income level when they apply. So we didn't know from the whole sample of possibilities that we invite them to participate regarding income. So that was we identified that at the end. Yeah, and we were lucky that these two groups are balanced. So I think that is part of the randomization. Yeah, so that's a one point. Okay, regarding the period, you are totally right. For, August and September maybe are not the best month in order to perform this field work. But since COVID last year started, and in Chile, it was much more intensive in the month of June, last June. So we almost thought that we were able to do anything. And after several meetings and also following all the protocols together with the local authorities, just only in August we were able to do the experiment. And just for safety issues, we were ready. I have to say we were ready around May, for starting on May, but for safety issues we didn't do anything. But so for September, it's not really cold in Talca. Yeah, so therefore we control in our specification for that. And we also, since we also have these measurements outside, we also know the specific weather condition for each day. But you are totally right. Regarding, you said really good ideas in order to go deep with this analysis. For example, this comparison between pellets users that they are not part of this program, and also I like the comment regarding comparing with the income level of the country, because we didn't have that in the document. And yes, regarding health benefits, that is another idea. Exactly, we can try to do from this information to identify benefit in the long term. Totally agree. Just I can thank you.
Thank you, Adolfo. I see sort of one more question in the chat, which is from me. I was asking how many households had a second stove, because you have these, and I don't know if I missed it in the presentation, but I wonder if this is something that you should look at a bit more carefully, particularly because it seems like these second stoves would have an important impact on pollution levels within the house, especially if you're using different types of technologies. So maybe you want to comment on that.
Yes, you're right. In the paper sheet we give them to the households, they wrote down if they were using a second stove, and actually that is also that also happened in September. That when it's not really cold, that they start to maybe they don't use the bigger stove, the firewood stove. They only have electrical. Yeah, so, but at least we control for that. We know during this 48 hours if they were using a second stove, or also the possibility that if they only were using the second stove or both together. Yeah, so we try to control for that. Definitely that is an issue. And also if you want to extend that to try to compute or to the amount of energy that the household use for heating, we should consider the second stove. So totally agree with the comment.
Okay, it looks like there are no further questions, so then we can move on to our last presenter. Thank you, Adolfo.
Thank you.
So the final presenter is Ravi Agarwal, and she'll be talking about a study in Kenya.
Thank you very much. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for this opportunity to present. This is fairly early stage work, so your comments would be really appreciated. So this is based on a collective model of consumption, production, and labor supply, and it's applied to energy demand in Kenya. And this is joint work with Jan Steckel at MCC in Berlin. So the model is contextualized within the debate on emissions pricing and economic development in sub-Saharan Africa, as CO2 emissions in the region have been rising at rapid rates over the last 10 years or so. In Kenya especially, it's been above average at around 9% per year. So emissions pricing seems to be an efficient instrument to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it also poses key development challenges. The first is that high energy prices could reduce household welfare. There would also be concerns of energy poverty. Increases in fossil fuel prices relative to those of charcoal or firewood can also increase biomass use. And this is especially problematic in cases where, for example, in Kenya, where over 90% of households already use biomass for cooking and heating, because there are associated health risks, especially for women and children. And there are also concerns of forest degradation. So sub-Saharan Africa currently accounts for 1/3 of the global unsustainable wood fuel harvest. Today, we investigate a specific dimension of biomass use, which is that of firewood collection. In Kenya, the burden of firewood collection falls largely on women. For example, in 2015-16, around 80% of women reported collecting firewood, but only 20% of men did so. The key research questions we ask in this study are, first of all, how do energy price increases, especially those of kerosene, impact households' demand for collected firewood versus fuels that they purchase on the market? So these purchased fuels can include electricity, kerosene, charcoal, etc. And then we ask, how does it impact individuals' labor supply for the market, as well as the time they spend collecting firewood? We then ask whether female labor supply could be a channel for biomass consumption. So when energy prices increase, does it mitigate or exacerbate biomass consumption? And lastly, we'll try to think about whether female bargaining power within the household could actually mitigate these increases in collective biomass. Our work broadly relates to, first of all, the agricultural economics literature, especially on rural household models, pioneered by Singh, Squire, and Strauss. It also builds on advances made on non-separability of consumption and production decisions. We're especially applying collective household models developed by Kiapori. And in the context of joint private and public consumption within households, they derive conditional sharing rules, which is really helpful for our work. We then also relate to the work on energy demand and consumption patterns. So for example, in Tanzania, there was a study suggesting that increases in fossil fuel prices can increase biomass use in sub-Saharan Africa overall. And there's also work saying that energy price increases can pose adverse welfare effects in low and middle-income countries. More recently, there's a literature on relating clean fuel use to better health outcomes, as well as talking about the effects of biomass use on female employment. So we begin with the collective model developed by Kiapori, but we also add household production of firewood. So first of all, households are maximizing the sum of weighted utilities of each of the members. And in the first case, we simply consider men and women as two types of members or two members in the household, and each of them has a Pareto weight 5. So essentially, each individual consumes firewood F. They consume their private leisure LA and LB, and they also consume other fuels that are purchased on the market. So M here is the vector of market fuels, like I mentioned earlier, like LPG, electricity, and so on. Then the household faces a common budget constraint. And this is more or less a standard constraint, but we also add a specific term here, which is the shadow profits that households derive from firewood production, which I will explain in a minute. We also have the time constraint. So each individual decides how much time to spend on leisure. This is Li here. And this is equal to the total time available or time endowment minus the time that they allocate between market work M and the time they spend collecting firewood. So these are the shadow profits of the household. So firewood is being sold at a particular price, P tilde F, and WA and WB are the wage rates. So essentially in this production function, you have the two individuals' time inputs as labor inputs in the process. And so we adopt a cost minimization framework. So households here are considered as firms in a joint framework, and they're minimizing the cost of producing a certain amount of firewood. And this quantity of firewood that needs to be produced can be determined based on households' consumption needs. So it's completely non-separable. We also assume that firewood is a marketable commodity. So technically households can collect it and then sell it on the market at a price that's determined in the shadow market. And an important assumption we need to make is that the production process is constant returns to scale. So we condition on factors like availability of forest land, the distance to the village or forest where households can collect firewood from, the forest cover, and so on. But after conditioning on those factors, we assume that the production process is constant returns. And this basically gives us a constant marginal cost of production. And in the competitive framework, we know that price will equal the marginal cost. And so we obtain a price of firewood that depends only on exogenous parameters. So it depends on the wages and production technology parameters. And the importance is that now the household can take this price or the cost of production as fixed in making their consumption decisions. We then obtain via the production process that the labor hours are partly determined by the conditional demand function. But here actually the firm is the household itself. So one implication is that if we want to reduce the time that women and children especially spend collecting firewood, then we need to think about the firewood demand of the household itself. Because if this declines, then it can reduce the time that they spend, contingent on supply side factors. And a household's demand for firewood collection itself will depend on the individual's preferences. It will depend on their Pareto weights and the prices and wages that they face. So here is the optimality condition for collected firewood. And on the left-hand side, this is basically a representation of the marginal utility that the household as a whole gets from firewood collection. And this is a weighted sum of the marginal utilities of the individuals A and B, and it's weighted by the Pareto weight. And on the right-hand side, so lambda is the Lagrange multiplier, and this is actually the marginal cost of firewood production. So you have the wage rates here, but these important terms here basically tell you how the demand for labor within the production process changes if the household starts demanding more firewood. So this is the link between production and labor supply here. And in the end, we'll basically obtain a firewood demand function, which depends on the household's income, on energy prices, on the wage rates, as well as the preferences, but it also depends probably on bargaining power, phi, which is the weight here, also interpreted as bargaining power. So imagine a case where a woman is the only person who collects firewood in the family, and she has a disutility from firewood collection. So if her bargaining power is too low in the household, her preference would be discounted more relative to the other members. And then in the end, firewood may end up being collected, even if she doesn't want to. Or it could be the other way around if other members want to or don't want to engage in collection. So we need to look at what will happen in the end based on the mixture of preferences and the bargaining power. I will now move on to some empirics. So we draw data from the Kenya Integrated Budget Survey for 2015-16, which is nationally representative. And it also provides detailed data on consumption and energy use. So we have data on the expenditures incurred over the last month for each of the fuels and the quantities that the households purchased. We also have data on the time spent by men, women, and children in the past week to collect each of the fuels. So for collected firewood and other biomass, etc. And the survey also distinguishes between purchased and collected firewood. Then for wage rates, rather than using the wages that are reported by the household members, we use county level wage rates for men and women for public works programs that take place in the counties. And we find that about 40% men and women engage in these public works. We then derive energy prices as the ratio of the reported costs or expenditures to the quantities. And these are averaged at the county level to mitigate concerns of indigeneity. The empirical estimation then has two steps. So first, we look at the effects of energy prices on labor supply for men and women in terms of the hours they spend working in the market and for firewood collection. And here we use a Tobit model to account for non-participation, so the corner solutions. And then we look at separately whether energy prices and wage rates actually affect firewood demand, and we use a simple linear regression model for this. Before the results, I will just present a few statistics. So this graph here shows the distribution of energy expenditure shares across expenditure terciles. And we see here that the share of collected firewood expenditures actually reduces, whereas the shares of LPG and electricity rise steadily over the expenditure distribution. We also have the distribution of hours worked. So the first thing is that around 82% women and 19% men engage in firewood collection. So the graph is has been drawn for the individuals that engage in collection. And on the left, the two lines on the left basically show the distribution of men and women in terms of hours spent over the past week in collecting firewood. And the graph for women, which is the black line here, is a little bit higher and to the right for that as that of men, which shows that they spend more time and more of them spend more time, although it's not too different. And that for market work, which is on the right, is positively skewed for men. So men spend on average more hours working on the market. Around a third of children also engage in firewood collection, and this is quite important to look at, but at the moment we don't include it in the model. I now have the results for male and female labor supply, and the key statistics that we're focusing on for the moment are kerosene prices, because we want to understand what combinations of different fuel prices might actually trigger an energy transition. So can we get households to switch to LPG, for example? And here we see that when kerosene prices increase by 1%, the log female hours worked for firewood and for men as well actually go up. So this is about 0.14% or 0.11%. So it's a little bit more for women than for men. But an important thing is that in this model, they look at the uncensored variable, so the underlying variable. So this is not only for the 20% who engage in firewood collection. At the same time, the time that women and men spend working in the market declines, and these are statistically significant. For other fuels, we find more conflicting patterns. So for electricity, we find that, again, the demand for firewood increases when electricity prices increase. But in the case of LPG, the demand declines. So this could be picking up that the common pattern that LPG and firewood are complements, rather than really being a causal effect. We also see that the time spent on firewood collection is positively related to the female wage rate, which is a bit counterintuitive. And one possibility is that because the format in which we include time spent on firewood in the model is to just treat it as an economic activity. It's not really treated as the negative of pleasure. So we need to think of more ways to basically capture it possibly as a cost to the household rather than something that they're gaining. We then look at what happens to firewood consumption. And again, first of all, we focus on the coefficient of kerosene prices. And this mirrors the previous result that we saw of positive effects on firewood quantity consumed. So the column on the right has a much higher coefficient because we actually include county-specific dummy variables which take care of some geographical heterogeneity. So we only have a single cross-section where we don't really have that kind of the rich data that many panel data structures offer. We find the same patterns with regard to electricity prices and LPG prices, also in terms of female wage rates. I think another interesting pattern is that the male wage rate seems to be negatively associated with firewood consumption. But this again could be a correlation that as households become richer, they sort of step up the energy ladder. So we are still working on some of the identification issues. And some of the next steps of the paper are to think more about bargaining power and try to find some measures of bargaining power to include in the model. Yeah, I think I'm done. So thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Ravi, and also done with plenty of time remaining. Ishita is your discussant. Ishita?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Ravi. This was a great presentation, and I really enjoyed reading your paper. I have some comments. Let me present my screen. Can you see my screen?
No, we are not seeing it.
Okay. So let me not present. Let me say. Okay. So let me not present. So I can just tell some of these comments that I have. So Ravi, just, I think it's a very interesting study that I came across, like, when you are actually looking at how the, relative prices when change for different fuels, how that impacts different fuels and overall energy demand. At the same time, the labor market impacts, the linkages between, fuel markets and labor demand, I have not seen many studies. So, there are while there are a number of studies which have been done in the first part, where you see how the relative prices, they impact energy demand, but not, the linkages between labor market and the fuel market. And we drive a lot of policy implications for the decarbonization, as we also saw the as we also heard from our key presenters in the policy session today, where they were talking about that we need to actually see how the how the changes in the relative prices, they can be framed to see the impacts in a more targeted manner. So, the first thing that I wanted to ask you, that you have considered the entire panel, right? So is this like the thing like, rural and urban combined analysis that you have done? Is like there are, so I wanted to know more like, if the difference between rural and urban is not much in terms of fuel availability, for example. So, that will very much, impact the results that you will get, right? So there are a lot of heterogeneous impacts that are possible in this kind of a framework, like, so we need to actually understand the distribution of those impacts. So have you thought about that, or, have you done, is it like this is still work in progress and you will be doing that going forward? But it will be good to actually talk more about the data first, like, the kind of, what are the current prices, for example, of different fuels, and what has been the trend, and, how, so, is there any existing subsidies, for example, prevailing in Kenya? What is the current scenario there? And then probably, you can develop on the theoretical model, which I think you have written very lucidly. You have derived all the structural equations and, done it very nicely, and, readers can follow it very much. But I think before that, it is, if you develop a section on the current trends, that will be, easier for the reader to follow, why this topic is important in context of Kenya, right? So relative prices and their interlinkages with labor market. Let me just open my notes. Okay, so I have some clarificatory comments also, like, when you assume that production function for the fuel firewood, there the shadow prices will again vary, right? Significantly across different regions. So if you account for those differences, how your analysis will change? So basically the shadow prices will very much be impacted by the availability of firewood, right? So how you are addressing that part in your model, and in your data, there will also be, I assume, like a lot of households will be there who will be self-employed in the agriculture, right? So are you imputing some, when you're considering the market opportunity, right? So are you considering those, are you imputing some wage for them, or you're dropping those households? If you can, clarify that, it will be helpful. And so in your paper, you have, in the study, you say, like, that you are extending the existing literature on by Shepori and Brownie and Shepori, like, so I think it will be good to upfront tell how you are extending that work, right, theoretically, because I think there are not many studies which are establishing this kind of a linkage in the labor market and the fuel market. So I think you should bring about those value addition in the papers upfront, that how you are extending, what are your contributions on the theoretical front, and what are your contributions on the empirical side. Right, so and how your results, they are what are the kind of policy implications that you are getting from the analysis. Now, are there any policy implications? So are there existing, say, policies in the fuel market or say labor market, which you can inform by this analysis that you are undertaking? So, what kind, what kind of, how the policymakers can better consume, this analysis. And yeah. So I have, so these are some of the comments that I have on your paper. So yeah, thanks.
Okay, yeah, thanks a lot. So firstly, you mentioned about rural-urban heterogeneity. So I mean, in the regressions, I sort of include the rural-urban dummy, but I know that your comment is more about really looking at heterogeneous impacts more carefully. So I will definitely do that. And yes, this is very early stage work. So most of what you've said are suggestions for me to look at. And of course, fuel availability is an issue, and actually it's becoming relatively scarce, which I thought was a bit unlikely, but it is the case. So one of the problems we face is that we have to derive the prices from expenditures and quantities reported by the household. And this is quite problematic. There isn't a separate price survey that we did for these fuels. So I will try to find a separate price survey of sorts, but this is a problem. I wanted to focus a bit more on kerosene actually, because it's still consumed by at least 20 to 25% of households, which is still quite high compared to other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And there is some potential then for reform here, especially the switch between LPG and kerosene, etc. On the production function, so in terms of shadow prices, do you mean the implicit price of firewood, or did you mean shadow wages? Because actually the way the shadow price is constructed, it's just, I mean, it depends on the wages of the individuals. So this would actually be at the household level.
Yeah, so I was meaning the shadow prices for the firewood, because you said that somewhere you derive that equation, which is like your wage rate divided by the marginal product of the labor that needs to be equated with the lambda, which is the shadow price, right? So yeah, so that will vary with marginal product of the labor, for the firewood collection will vary with firewood availability. So I mean that. So that will significantly vary and from region to region, and that's why the heterogeneous impacts become important, right? Until unless that firewood availability is almost homogeneous in Kenya. So yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Actually, there are some variables on availability of forest land at community level, so I could probably use those. I think it would have to be controlled for in some way, but you're absolutely right, and there would be a distribution of productivity of men and women to collect firewood, and this is something I need to think more about. In terms of self-employment, so I mean, the idea is to just compute an aggregate measure for the time that people spend in other employment. So it would sort of be everything else. But you're right that, I mean, they engage in many different activities. So it's still not clear what kind of wage should be used for them, because again, the wage would not be exogenous that they report. So we're trying to think of some exogenous wage type variables. But like for the moment, just what's in the paper at the moment, we had dropped people employed in agriculture if nothing was reported. So there are other entrepreneurs in the data set, and their wages and salaries are reported, but whatever wasn't reported was dropped. Theoretically extending, I didn't really see the paper as a contribution to theoretically extend Kiapori's work, but I mean, thanks for seeing it like that. It's something like a mixture between the theory and empirics, just applied to a policy question. So I think that's where I would try to motivate the paper a bit more. And in terms of policy implications, I mean, the initial idea was, could female empowerment or empowerment of individuals in the household actually mitigate biomass consumption? That was the initial idea, but we're still a while to go before we can show that in the paper, and then I guess we will talk about policies. But I will look more into the energy subsidies and the prices that you talk about. Yeah, thank you so much.
Great, thanks. Ravi, I put one question in the chat, which is about household composition and how that might affect fuel collection tasks and activities. And what, to what extent have you looked at this, since it could relate in pretty complex ways on the labor supply side from the households?
Yeah, I think, you're right about household composition and the links between consumption and production. And I think this was also shown in an important paper that basically rejected separability. So, we were thinking of extending the model later on to include children as well. But we understand that the consumption needs of the households would actually determine the production side. So we do need to look into that a bit more. I think household size in general is typically a good proxy for firewood consumption, depending on the number of members and food consumption requirements and so on. But it will definitely play a role. I didn't quite understand your question about the wages. So I think that depending on different activities that people engage in, the wages reported will be different. So, the wage distribution is kind of endogenous, it's a problem. But
yeah, that's kind of the point, in the sense that, the household might have consumption needs that it's trying to satisfy, and therefore adult labor market participation will be also influenced in some ways by those consumption needs. And therefore, you might get these counterintuitive results where it looks like higher wages also predict more fuel collection, just because those households have greater consumption needs in general. And just thinking about that a little bit and how it relates to household composition as well.
yeah, I think what you're suggesting is that we have multiple outcomes that are related to the same set of variables. So I guess I would need to think more about a system of equations to estimate, because it's definitely true that household size and like adult equivalent scales affect both of those things, consumption and labor market. I'll think about it more. Thanks.
I don't see any other questions. Any last questions, comments from the audience? If not, thanks all for a great session, for nice papers. Encourage you to join the Gather social rooms, which are open, and you can find the links to them in your program. I think some of them have already been filling up. Otherwise, we will hope to see you all tomorrow as well. Thanks for a great session.
Thanks, Mark, for sharing.
Thank you.